I have the great honor of introducing our next speaker, Mr. Jeff Thompson. He's the Vice President of Government and Corporate Relations for UC Health. In his role, he oversees and coordinates government relations at the local, the state, and the federal level with elected officials and key leaders in our governmental departments and agencies. Jeff Thompson is currently the chair of the Colorado Hospital Association's Legislative Council. He works closely with area business organizations, which include the Chamber of Commerce, economic development organizations, and directly with many businesses and civic leaders. Big hand for Jeff Thompson, please.
Thank you, Alan. Very much a pleasure being with you today. And if you've been here all day and sitting here, I'm very sorry. It's a beautiful, beautiful Colorado fall day. Sorry you've been missing it. But thank you for hanging in there this afternoon, and I hope I can enlighten you a little bit on what's going on in our really, really chaotic world of health policy these days. Certainly what's happening in Washington, what's happening with our state legislature, and just everywhere you turn, health policy is a #1 priority issue no matter what you're looking at. So today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about all of that. So just a quick commercial, UC Health, and we're very, very proud to be a sponsor here today. Just to give you an idea of who we are and what we are, we're just over 5 years old, about 5.5 years old. We're one of the largest now health systems and hospital systems in the state of Colorado, right up there with Centura, Health One, Sisters of Charity, Leavenworth. 9 hospitals, over 19,500 employees. You can see the amount of patient visits that we have, and we give back to our communities that we serve nearly $600 million a year in community benefit. We're very, very proud of that. Thank you. This is part of it. So with that, here's a little snapshot of what I'm going to provide for you today. An overview of what's going on at the federal level right now with the Affordable Care Act, a little summary there, and then talk to you about what's been going on with the Republicans and the Trump administration with all of the stuff that's been going on. I'll hopefully make a little bit of sense of that for you. Also, what's been happening in the state of Colorado, a lot of things happening there. We'll look at the 2017 legislative session. We'll wrap that up for you in terms of all the health legislation that we dealt with. We'll look ahead to 2018 because all of a sudden it's right around the corner, and then looking to the election in 2018, which also is playing into all of the politics surrounding health and health policy. And you'll see that throughout. So with that, I'm going to start with a quote. Maybe some of you heard this. This was President Trump with the National Governors Association just after he was inaugurated, about a week after, in February, about a month after, I'm sorry, in February 27, 2017. Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated. And you'll find out why. So President Trump also, just before he was inaugurated, was talking about his vision of health policy going forward in his administration. We're going to have insurance for everybody. Americans can expect to have great health care. It will be in a much simplified form, much less expensive, and much better than Obamacare. It'll be another plan, but it'll be beautifully covered. I don't want single payer, but what I do want is to be able to take care of people. So with that, let's give a little background. One slide on the background of what we have seen the last several years with the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act was signed into law by President Obama on March 28, 2010. After about 4 years of ramp up, it really kicked in the first of the year 2014 when Medicaid and the marketplace exchanges began enrolling new patients. Since 2014, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, and this came out just this last month, more than 20 million people are now have been covered since 2014. Approximately 10.3 people in the country were enrolled through the private marketplaces, the exchanges. Approximately 11 million through Medicaid. The total uninsured rate in the United States dropped from more than 44 million to less than 28 million in 2016, but there's still 10.4% of the population remain uninsured. In Colorado, Colorado did adopt Medicaid expansion and did adopt the exchange in Colorado, Connect for Health Colorado, and since that time, nearly 600,000 Coloradans gained coverage since 2014. And approximately 1.3 million citizens in Colorado are covered by Medicaid now, almost 25% of our population. Getting close to 200,000 enrollees through the marketplace or the exchange products through Connect for Health Colorado. However, about 350,000 people in Colorado remain uninsured. The good news is that it wasn't all that long ago that we had about 17% of our population not covered by any health care whatsoever. They were totally uninsured. That figure has now dropped down to 6.5% of our population. That's been pretty amazing, and it's been very, very helpful for hospitals especially who have had to cost shift care for the uninsured for many, many years. At least it's providing a payer source for hospitals and providers, but we still have 6.5% of our population uninsured for all kinds of various reasons. So let's get into the federal update and what's been going on the last few months since the Republicans took both houses in Congress and also for the first time in 8 years took over the White House. So everybody expected this whole repeal thing was going to happen, that the Republicans would get in, first thing they would do right out of the chute would be to repeal the Affordable Care Act, because that's all they've been running on for the last 7 years before the last election, since President Obama was elected. And he came in with a huge majority of Democrats, if you remember, in 2008. So much so that they were able to unanimously support through the House and through the Senate the Affordable Care Act without getting one single Republican vote for the final vote. And that's what has created all the political turmoil since then. So everybody just figured that the Republicans would start right away with repeal and replace or just a repeal. But it didn't take until March 6th, 2017, before they introduced the first effort to try to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. So there was a lot of internal caucus dissent in the Republican Party. There's a far right wing called the Freedom Caucus. There are about 40 members roughly of the Freedom Caucus. They locked down and they said they would not support any bill that, quote unquote, didn't flat out repeal the Affordable Care Act. Not a repeal and replace, not fixing part of the Affordable Care Act. They wanted total repeal. And so they withheld their votes. They said, we're going to be a no vote. So the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, would not have enough votes to move it forward. However, after negotiation, after a couple more months of trying to figure it out, of accommodating some of the people on the far right, they held a vote, and it finally passed the House of Representatives on May 4th, but only by 4 votes. You can see the vote count, 217 to 213. 20 Republican members ended up voting no, including Mike Coffman from Colorado. He was one of the 20, joining all of the Democrats in the House in voting no. So the key provisions of this bill were that it repeals or delays all of the Affordable Care Act imposed taxes, eliminated both the employer and the individual mandates. That was to totally appease the right wing. It ended federal enhanced Medicaid expansion by 2020, transitions the federal Medicaid funding, and this is a key for states, transitions and transforms Medicaid funding from the feds to per capita block grants to states. They would just get a lump sum of money based on their enrolled Medicaid population, their historically enrolled Medicaid population, but it would not be what it is today, which is based on a funding formula. Colorado gets about 50-50. Colorado General Fund puts up about 50%. The federal government matches that 50% as well to make it about an $800 million annual budget for the state of Colorado, $800 billion budget for the state of Colorado, for instance. So this would have tremendous impact on the state of Colorado by reducing the amount of money that would come in from the federal government. And so it would have hurt those states like Colorado and others that expanded Medicaid. It also permitted states to waive other portions of the Affordable Care Act, including essential benefits, and that gets down into that what you've been hearing about pre-existing conditions. It would have allowed states basically to water down provisions related to pre-existing conditions, was one of those essential health benefits. So the House-approved bill went to the Senate, and that's where the fun began. So there were 4 attempts in the Senate to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, starting at about towards the end of July through September, but always figured that it ended up being a 3-week August recess that didn't start until about 10 days into August and went through Labor Day. So there's that section in there where they were not in session. But they gave it a shot, and they first took up the repeal and replace the American Health Care Act, which came over from the House, but they renamed it the Better Care Reconciliation Act. And this would have repealed and replaced the Affordable Care Act. But I mentioned the 60 votes required there, and the reason is that under something called budget reconciliation, if they pass a budget under reconciliation, it's only a majority vote. So that would, since there are 100 members of the Senate, that would mean 51 votes to support a budget bill. And if you can put another piece of legislation in there, including the Affordable Care Act, that too would only require 51 votes. However, when they brought the Better Care Reconciliation back before the Senate parliamentarian, she ruled that a good portion of that bill did not qualify for reconciliation, meaning that it would take 60 votes to block a filibuster. And so it would have taken 60 votes in order to pass the Better Care Reconciliation Act. So when they did vote on it, it failed eventually on a vote of 43 to 57, actually with 9 Republicans voting no on that. So then they went back to the drawing board, came back with another provision. And by the way, that first provision, and this is why a lot of the Republicans didn't support it, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, estimated that about 50 million, that would have left 50 million uninsured by 2026, 22 million more than under the Affordable Care Act. So it was huge. That number scared a lot of Republicans away. So they went back to the drawing board and came back with the second option, and that was the Obamacare Repeal and Reconciliation Act. Now this one only required a majority vote. So this would have repealed coverage provisions under the Affordable Care Act, including employer and individual mandates. It would have repealed Medicaid expansion and premium subsidies that are in place for those those individuals qualifying for the exchanges. They receive tax subsidies. So this would have eliminated those provisions in the next 2 years. It would have left a lot of market reforms in place, which appealed to a couple more Republicans. And so this one then failed on a vote of 45 to 55. Now these votes happened just before the Senate took a recess. So after this one failed, they kind of gave up and went back to the drawing board, and then came back after this, the recess, and then they brought forward what they called the skinny repeal of the Affordable Care Act. So this one basically did repeal the Affordable Care Act. So their effort here was to try to get all of the Republican votes, or as many as they possibly could, and they brought it back to the floor of the Senate. Now here the Congressional Budget Office estimated about 16 million people would be uninsured by 2026. The premiums would be about 20% higher in the exchanges. This was all just rough estimates from CBO. There were actually other independent institutions that were basically scoring the bill, coming back and saying, no, that 16 million is way under. It would really be more like 30 million. So the plan was to do this real skinny repeal bill, and then to get it back over to the House of Representatives, and then the House and the Senate could convene a conference committee to resolve the differences and maybe build a coalition bill, a compromise bill that the House and Senate Republicans could both agree to. So the Senator McConnell, who's the majority leader, thought he had the majority of the senators lined up. Senator McCain, you probably all know that he is suffering from brain cancer now. He had just gone through his brain surgery and some chemotherapy before he came back after the recess. He walked onto the Senate floor that evening when they were going to vote on this skinny repeal bill. And everybody thought he was coming back and would be a supporting vote because they already knew that they had lost two other Republicans. Senator Collins from Maine and Senator Murkowski from Alaska had already said they were voting no on this because it basically did away with any of the Medicaid expansion. And in Medicaid in Maine and Alaska, very, very important. So they had already committed to vote no. Now keep in mind the Republicans only had a 52 vote majority, so they could only lose 2 votes. And then the President pro tem of the Senate is the Vice President, Pence, who would have cast the tie-breaking vote. So that would have made it a 51 vote majority and it could have passed. However, when they got down the roll call to Senator McCain, he stood up in front of the Senate, went down to the well, and this was at 2 o'clock in the morning Washington time. I was up at midnight watching this vote. He got up, went down to the well, stood up, stuck his thumb up, no. That was the 3rd vote, and it went down. So everybody felt this was it. It was done, it was over. President Trump was angry. Republican conservatives all over the country were angry. So the Republicans kind of sat back for a while. However, 2 other senators, Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina and Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, had been working on their own bill throughout all of this. And so finally they came back with a bill that would repeal and replace part of the Affordable Care Act. So you can see the provisions here. Starting in 2020, it would shift the federal Medicaid spending to states via block grants and per capita cap spending. I mentioned that one in the House bill. Would have eliminated Medicaid expansion and the exchange tax credits and the cost-sharing reduction payments and some of the basic essential benefits by 2020. The American Hospital Association estimated that more than 20 million people would be uninsured and over $275 billion would be cut to the states by 2026. And in Colorado, this would have left about 286,000 uninsured and would have reduced our state's budget by nearly $4 billion by 2026. Well, this bill also failed to get 50 committed votes before they even took the vote. So they knew Murkowski and Collins, McCain, and Rand Paul from Kentucky all were going to vote no. So they knew they didn't have the votes. So Majority Leader McConnell did not bring it back up for a vote. And so the Graham-Cassidy bill basically just fell off the vine. So after Graham-Cassidy, the Senate is now back to the drawing board. Where do we go from here? And I put this quote up that I pulled off of the Politico website. And this was a quote that came from Senator Alexander, Lamar Alexander from Tennessee. Senator Alexander and his counterpart on the Senate Democrat side, he is the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and Senator Patty Murray is the ranking member of the Democrat Party. She's the ranking member of the committee. They'd been working on kind of a compromise bill that would provide some marketplace fixes to the Affordable Care Act. But even Senator Alexander was discouraged. He said, even though Graham-Cassidy might be dead, few Republicans expect a sudden shift to bipartisanship. He felt his bill was dead, basically. He said the environment simply isn't conducive to it. So then he also went on to say, we stopped the bipartisan talks last week because my goal wasn't just to get a bipartisan agreement, it was to get a bipartisan result. I didn't see any way we could get to one in the current political environment, he said shortly before Senator Collins announced her opposition to the Graham-Cassidy bill. That environment hasn't changed, Alexander said. Maybe it does change, maybe it hasn't. So continuing after Graham-Cassidy, the Republicans are obviously under a great amount of national pressure from Republicans and conservatives to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. Senator McConnell has said, we haven't given up changing the American healthcare system, but he has shifted his focus now to tax reform. Senators Graham and Cassidy remain optimistic that they can move their plan forward, and they're going to continue to try. They may try to stick it somehow in the new budget bill for 2018 or possibly 2019, or maybe put it in the tax reform bill as a rider amendment via the Senate Finance Committee. I doubt both of those options will happen, but who knows right now? It's crazy. So stay tuned on that one. So what you may see now is that the Senator Alexander, Senator Murray bipartisan reset in the Senate Help Committee. They are looking now at bipartisan fixes to the Affordable Care Act, and there's new optimism that they may be able to come up with a bipartisan bill that could be forwarded in the Senate. Chances are it still is not going to get very far. It could get out of the Senate, but House Republicans are already saying they aren't going to buy into this. So the short-term fixes they're looking at are minimizing health insurance premium increases, extending cost-sharing reduction payments that are available as premium subsidies for the exchange products, giving states also flexibility to establish reinsurance programs to cover high-cost, expensive procedures. So after all of this is settled down now, I happened to catch an article or a column in Saturday, Sunday's Wall Street Journal that I think hit the nail right on the head as to why the Republicans have been failing with this effort. Peggy Noonan, the columnist, said, the Republicans failed because they tried to do what Mr. Obama, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and Majority Leader Harry Reid did back in 2010, passing Obamacare on a party line vote. But remember, they had supermajorities in both houses. But bills that make great changes in how Americans live, such as Social Security, Medicare, you can include Medicaid in there, must always have broad two-party support. Those are entitlements that basically are almost impossible, if not totally impossible, to repeal. To do anything to fix them is going to take bipartisan two-party support. Healthcare is experienced now as a fully national issue. We've certainly elevated it to that level. Healthcare reform will have to come from both parties, or it will not be accepted by America. And I think she's dead on with that. Shifting gears, we're going to look at the state legislature now. So this is what happened just this last year in the Colorado State Legislature. First of all, it was the 71st General Assembly, the first session, convened on January 11th for 120 days, constitutionally set. They can only meet for 120 days that adjourn May 10th. The political landscape under the Gold Dome right now, you have John Hickenlooper's our governor. He's in his third term, or his second term rather, but in his third year. So he has one more year of governor before he's term limited. The state Senate has 35 members. Senate President is Kevin Grantham from Canyon City, and Republicans hold a one-vote majority in the Senate, 18-17, and that's pretty critical. And I'll get back to that when we look at a couple bills here. In the House of Representatives, there are 65 members. They're controlled by the Democrats by a 9-vote majority, 37-28, and the Speaker of the House is Crisanta Duran from here in Denver. So the session started in January. A total of 681 bills were introduced, 375 of those in the House, 306 in the Senate. 411 bills passed the legislature and were sent to the governor for signature. That's pretty significant because when you look at the split majorities in the House and Senate, every bill has to pass with bipartisan support. You can't pass a bill all the way through the legislature without bipartisan support. And the fact that they passed 411 bills is saying something. Now, a lot of those were technical changes to statutes, et cetera, but I thought it was pretty remarkable that they passed that many bills. And so only 270 were defeated. To give you an example of the healthcare influence, we tracked 90 bills throughout the legislative session. That's a significant percentage of bills, probably about 16-17%. The key issues going into this year's legislative session included the budget, of course, always is a top priority. And this year, last year, the year before, we started seeing more pressures under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that had passed in 1992 that limits the amount of revenues and the amount of expenditures that the state legislature can deal with every year. Also, a key issue this year was construction defects and dealing with that. Another issue always is a big issue, education, whether it's K-12, higher ed, usually funding. Both K-12 and higher ed have had budget increases coming this year. The economy, employment, workforce, always key issues. Health and healthcare, obviously. The one I kind of passed over up there was transportation. That generated a lot of debate and a lot of discussion throughout the legislative session. And they basically ended up with nothing except for one provision, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. So the key priority health and healthcare issues that the legislature dealt with this last session were the hospital provider fee enterprise, and this has TABOR implications. I'll describe that in just a minute. Expanding Medicaid demands in Colorado. This obviously has registered a lot of budgetary concerns. 1.3 million people in Colorado now enrolled in Medicaid creates a tremendous amount of pressure on the state budget. And also the uncertainty of what's coming from Washington. This played out throughout the legislative session. They weren't quite sure what to expect, and obviously nothing really happened, at least has not happened as yet, but there's still the future uncertainty that they're looking at. Health and healthcare and hospital cost transparency was another big issue this year at the legislature, and there were a couple bills dealing with that I'll touch on. Freestanding emergency departments. This is something new in Colorado, very new in Colorado, just another way of delivering health care. Freestanding emergency departments, freestanding urgent care centers, a lot of confusion, very, very difficult issue to get around, and a lot of regulatory and licensure issues coming up. We'll touch on that. Mental and behavioral health is always an issue. Greatly underfunded, greatly undersupported, but a huge need throughout this country. And so this is something that the legislature deals with or tries to tackle every year. Technology is playing a new role, continuing new roles in health and healthcare. Telehealth is one of those areas. Legislature has had every year over the last 5 years, they've had at least one and mostly 2 or 3 telehealth related bills or technology bills that they've dealt with. Health insurance, always an issue. Transparency, consumer protections, that's always been an issue, and there were some bills introduced on that. So let me talk a little bit about the hospital provider fee, because this was huge. The hospital provider fee is a federal Medicaid and additional supplemental Medicaid funding program that was authorized by Congress about 20 years ago. It permits states that opt into doing this provider fee funding mechanism to have every single hospital in their state agree to submit a calculated fee each year that is then matched by the federal government on a one-to-one basis. So in Colorado, just to give you an idea, and it gets down here a little bit, but just to give you an idea of what that means, is total, it's averaged since 2010, that provider fee that the hospitals put in has averaged a little over $600 million. So when that's matched dollar for dollar by the federal government, that comes out to $1.2 billion in additional Medicaid funds that can go back to the hospitals. So the legislature in 2009 passed House Bill 1293, which created the hospital provider fee and was implemented in 2010. However, as the provider fee went forward, we all knew, we on the inside knew, that that fee portion, that $600 million I mentioned that the hospitals had been putting up front to be matched, that fee has been dedicated to the TABOR revenue cap. So it has been treated the same way that your income taxes, your state income taxes, state sales and use taxes, as all part of the general fund. The hospital provider fee, that $600 million, also was applicable to the general fund revenues, but not general fund. It was a single purpose fee. So in order to fix that, over the last 3.5 years, one of the provisions that the legislature can do is create a fee enterprise, and they've done it about 18 different times. So there's enterprises for higher ed, enterprises for highways, enterprises for wildlife management. All of these have enterprise status so that whatever fees are raised through licenses, tuition, registrations, et cetera, that are single purpose are designated as enterprises. And under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, an enterprise is defined as a state-owned business for a specific purpose. So over the last 3.5 years or so, we've been trying to get an enterprise bill for the hospital provider fee passed, primarily to drop those revenues down below the TABOR revenue cap. Well, the last 3 years, it had been defeated or never even brought up in the legislature. But there were some things happening this last year that really generated more interest in this, and we're going to hit on that right now. So when the Governor and Joint Budget Committee started looking at this year's budget, starting in July 1, 2017, they estimated that the revenue cap for Tabor was going to be breached by about $225 million. So with mandatory spending, constitutional and statutory spending that's already in place, that was going to leave approximately a $400 million gap that was going to have to be filled by budget cuts. So when the legislature brought forward the long bill this year, which is the annual budget bill, in order to reach that $400 million, they proposed to cut $264 million out of the provider fee, the part that the hospitals put in, that $600 million. So that would have been reduced by $264 million. And then when you apply the federal match, you can see that it was well over $500 million, a $500 million that was going to be submitted back to the hospitals. So this was going to be projected to be about a 43% reduction in total hospital reimbursements under Medicaid from the last year's budget. This was significant because in Colorado, there were a number of hospitals throughout the state, mostly rural hospitals, that have been really struggling the last few years anyway. And there are about a half a dozen, according to the Colorado Hospital Association, there were about a half a dozen of those rural hospitals that were teetering on going under, of having to be dissolved. So this budgetary shortfall was going to impact those rural hospitals significantly. Just for UC Health alone, you can see the bottom line number there. Compared to last year, we would have been down over $40 million, which would have been about a 51% drop from where we were in 2016. So that budget was critical to hospitals. So late in the session, the House and Senate decided to get together and put a bill together to try to fix this hospital provider fee. Now keep in mind that Senate President Kevin Grantham was probably the third or second most powerful person in the state capitol, had said before the legislature even started and repeated it several times, including to me and my boss in a private meeting we had to him. He said these exact words: hospital provider fee enterprise is off the table, non-starter, I'm not talking about it. However, as time went on during the legislative session and the budgetary woes and the budget rolled out, they could see where the issues were lining up. So Senator Grantham decided he would be okay if a bill was introduced starting in the Senate to try to fix this. So Senator Jerry Sonnenberg from Sterling and Senator Lucia Guzman, from here in Colorado, you're actually sitting in Senator Guzman's district here. She's the minority leader. I might add that Senator Sonnenberg is President pro tem of the Senate, so he's right underneath Kevin Grantham. Representatives John Becker from Fort Morgan, Republican, and Democrat Majority Leader Casey Becker from Boulder also were the bill sponsors. So this bill started going through the process and ultimately passed on the last day of the session by a vote of 25-10 in the Senate and 49-16 in the House. The 10 votes were all Republicans in the Senate, the 16 votes were all Republicans in the House. But that also meant that a significant number of Republicans had to support this bill. So when you add all of that together, out of 100 legislators, almost 3/4 of them voted in favor of the enterprise bill, just to show you what happened. And I'll get back to it in just a second. But the key provisions, and the reason that you look at the House or the Senate bill title concerning sustainability of rural Colorado was exactly what I was telling you about the rural hospitals. But what this bill did was that it added several other things concerning rural Colorado. One of the things it did was it reduced the Tabor cap by $200 million, so that gave them a little more budgetary flexibility. It also increased copays for Medicaid patients for certain outpatient services, not by much, $1 or $2 for certain procedures. It provided additional funding for rural schools and capital construction and transportation projects, required each state department of the state of Colorado to estimate about a 2% budget cut for this next year, and created the business personal property tax of a small amount. But all of this together is what we're able to bring some of the Republicans on board to help support the bill. So the bill, the reason for passage was the bill sponsors. These people, there were several times this thing was coming unraveled, but getting to yes through negotiation and compromise, significant bipartisan and leadership support, a huge team lobbying effort led by the Colorado Hospital Association and the business communities throughout Colorado, and hospital CEOs stepping up and weighing in, especially those rural hospital CEOs. I can't say enough about what they did to help get this bill passed. It was huge. It was absolutely huge. So at the end of the day, as they say these days, the bill did pass with a significant majority in both the House and Senate. And I can tell you from many, many years of lobbying, I have not seen a bipartisan bill of this magnitude get through our legislature in, I'll bet, 20 years. I literally, the day the bill was signed, actually the day the bill passed the legislature, I almost started crying, literally. I was so moved by what I had seen and heard, and those legislators coming to the floor to support this bill. It was just tremendous, and what it did for rural Colorado, I can't even begin to tell you. So that was huge. So I'll go through a lot of these other bills rather quickly, and then I'll start taking some question and answers. So I mentioned the hospital transparency. So there was a bill introduced, Senate Bill 65, regarding transparency in direct pay healthcare prices. So this bill that did pass requires hospitals to list prices for the 50 most used inpatient services, and also for hospitals required healthcare prices to be listed and posted on our websites for the 25 most used outpatient services by hospitals. This actually was supported by CHA, the Hospital Association, because it met with the CHA's current transparency policy. And actually that policy goes even further beyond. So this bill ultimately passed the legislature and was signed by the governor on April 6th. But there was another transparency bill that came up late in the session. State Representative Chris Kennedy introduced House Bill 1236. I might add, this bill was also one of the bills, there were about 7 of them, that Lieutenant Governor Lynn had been interested in getting introduced as well. So this bill would have gone far beyond what the other bill did or where we could even tolerate. It would have required hospitals to submit annual Medicare cost reports and audited financial statements to the Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing each year. It would have included, the financial statements would have had to broken out additional sub-reports on uncompensated care spending and administrative costs. This was going to be a huge administrative burden, and without a lot of understanding about what the Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing would really do with this information. So this bill was introduced late in the session. It went through the House, got to the Senate, and the Senate agreed that it was just too much right now and towards the end of the session, and so it was postponed indefinitely, killed in the State Affairs Committee on April 24th. I'll get back to transparency in a minute. They did deal with freestanding emergency departments, but the first bill that was introduced, Senate Bill 64 by Senator Kafalis, had a broad range of additional licensure and regulatory requirements that would have had to be met. It was just too much for the Republican, he was a Democrat from Fort Collins, it was too much for the Republican Senate to tolerate. More regulation, more regulation, more regulation. So this bill didn't get very far. It was killed in committee on February 8th. Second bill was drafted late in the session on freestanding emergency departments, but not introduced. It's one of those bills I think we'll see back in 2018. Mental and behavioral health. A very significant bill did pass, Senate Bill 207. This coordinates a statewide behavioral health crisis system, eliminates the use of the criminal justice system, jails, to hold individuals solely with mental and behavioral health crises, and clarifies and enhances some provisions for hospitals whereby we can hold mental and behavioral health patients for 72 hours within our emergency departments. It also provides, and this is significant, an additional $7 million on top of the $19 million that's annually budgeted to support a crisis response system in Colorado. This bill was supported by CHA and did pass the General Assembly on May 8th, a couple days before the end of the session, and signed by the governor. A couple of other bills of interest. I mentioned telehealth coverage. Senate Bill 203. This bill would have repealed the Connect for Health Colorado Insurance Exchange. It was introduced by Senator Smallwood on the first day of the session and was postponed indefinitely on the last day of the session. Never did get out of the Senate. Senate Bill 88 provided for additional transparency for insurance companies regarding advising patients of when their doctors or providers were going to be in and out of network to give patients a little more time to be able to find replacement providers under their insurance programs. And this bill was carried by Senator Holbert, who is the majority leader in the Senate, was signed into law by Governor Hickenlooper on April 18th. So a couple notes of transparency. We recognize the governor, legislators, everybody in the state, including the Hospital Association, including hospitals, do feel that transparency is still necessary. The CHA has subsequently just produced hospital transparency reports for every single hospital, over 100 in the state of Colorado, and just this last week released this entire transparency report, well over 150 pages, to legislators, the governor, lieutenant governor, key cabinet members, the media. You may start reading about it any time now. This was released just this last week on October 5th. So almost every provision that was in Senator or Representative Kennedy's bill, the Hospital Association went ahead and did. So we feel that that's a huge move forward. And Lieutenant Governor Lynn told me on the phone just the other day that for her purposes, this probably eliminates any possibility that any legislation on transparency will come from the governor's office this year. Legislators can still introduce whatever bills they want, regardless of what the governor says. So next year, hospital transparency could still be an issue. Freestanding emergency departments will still be an issue. A bill will be introduced, at least one, I'm sure. Mental and behavioral health, and this year you are going to see several bills coming out of the interim committee on opioid addictions and the whole issue surrounding opioids. So you could see bills on prescribing, overdose treatment, prevention, education, et cetera. Mandated nurse-to-patient ratios. This comes up every once in a while. We may see a bill on this, and this the bill that they're talking about would be limited to ICUs and in only those hospitals that are level 2 trauma centers, which would include a lot of majority hospitals, certainly up and down the Front Range, including University of Colorado Hospital, actually all of our hospitals within our system, major hospitals. Also, just sitting back and just waiting to see what comes from Congress. And if the state's going to have to come up with legislation to comply with whatever changes come up relative to the Affordable Care Act or any other health care legislation nationally going forward. So looking further ahead next year, the election, Governor Hickenlooper, as I mentioned, is term limited. There are currently 5 announced Democrat candidates, 4 announced Republican candidates. Attorney General Kaufman is kind of on the fence right now. She may enter the race, so that one's not quite settled yet. It's going to lead to a lot of interesting primary and nomination debates going on. In the state legislature, 18 of the 35 Senate seats are up for election this year. 7 of those senators are term limited, including Senator President Grantham. So those seats are open. All 65 House seats for two-year terms are up for election this year, and 5 state representatives are term limited, so those are open seats. So the U.S. House of Representatives also will be voted on this year. All 7 seats in Colorado will be up for election. 1 open seat in Colorado, as it stands right now, District 2, which is Larimer and Boulder County primarily, gets over onto the western slope a little bit. Congressman Polis has announced his candidacy for governor, most of you may know, and so that seat is an open seat. There are no U.S. Senate races in Colorado this year. Senator Gardner's seat comes up in 2020, by the way, the same year as the president, and Senator Bennett just recently won, so he doesn't come back up until 2022. So on the national side of the 100 Senate seats, keep in mind the Republicans control the Senate 52 to 48. That includes, the 48, by the way, includes 2 independents, one from Vermont and one from Maine. Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont and Senator Agnes King from Maine are both independents. So 34 U.S. Senate seats are up for election in 2018. These are for 6-year terms. Interestingly, this year, only 9 Republican seats, but 25 Democrat seats. It could be difficult, but the Democrats only need to pick up 3 seats to regain the majority. In the House of Representatives, all 435 seats are up. Current majority is to the Republicans, 240 to 194. There is 1 vacancy. That happens to be a representative from Utah who just announced his resignation about a month ago. And so all 435 seats are up. The Democrats, you can see, need a pickup of 24 to regain the majority there. The next presidential election is 2020. So with that, healthcare and beyond, it is crazy. Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated. Mr. President, you are exactly correct. Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Yes. Interesting question. The first question is, even if the Affordable Care Act is not repealed, can President Trump essentially starve the Affordable Care Act to death financially? No. What he can do through the administrative process is through the Department of Health and Human Services, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They can do a lot of things that can alter the Affordable Care Act, but still have to be within the realm of the statute to lessen some of the impact of the Affordable Care Act. It can't kill the Affordable Care Act because, like I said, whatever rule or regulation is brought forward by the Department of Health and Human Services, it still has to meet with under the federal statute. However, the one thing I would mention is that of the 2,700-page Affordable Care Act, over 1,400 times in the bill, it says the Secretary shall. That means the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall whatever. Make a rule regarding this, make a regulation regarding that. So the Trump administration can certainly have a lot of latitude in terms of what they can do. Financially, as the question is asking, only Congress can deal with the finances. So as long as, and a great portion of the Affordable Care Act was already put on a continual budget, so a lot of that's going to continue. Some of those key areas that they have to deal with, though, are some of the market stabilization reforms that need to be done in order to shore up the marketplaces. I think that is somewhere we can see some bipartisan support in fixing some of the potential financial dilemmas. But right now, Medicaid stays the same, Medicaid expansion stays the same, and the Trump administration really can't do too much about that. Oh, interesting question. On the scare tactic label of socialism, what is wrong with single-payer health insurance? Yikes. I don't know that I really want to get into that. Obviously, you saw that Colorado defeated Amendment 69 on the ballot last year that would have instituted a single-payer plan in the state of Colorado by an overwhelming vote, more than 84% negative vote in the state of Colorado on that. I think there are a lot of issues with it. I think just in terms of trying to figure out the financing, trying to figure out the tax increases, the tax support for it. I think I think the Initiative 69 that was on the ballot last year would have required at least $20 billion in new taxes to come up with. So I think it was scary for a lot of people. Obviously, 84% of the people in the state. It was scary for the state to get into that. And I think that it just creates a lot of dilemma. I think, honestly, I may not see it in my lifetime, but I think somewhere you're going to see the country evolve, this is my own opinion, evolve towards some kind of Medicare for all system. Whether it actually is a single payer or not, but I think it would open the doors for the availability of Medicare coverage for any U.S. citizen. So I think we might see that sometime in the future. Where can we, here we go. Where can we see the hospital's list of costs for patient services? So I mentioned Senate Bill 65, so all of those costs that the hospitals are now required to post have to be posted by January 1, 2018 on every hospital website. So all you'll have to do is go to that hospital's website, find the link to those costs and prices, and they will be listed for you. And those have to be done by January 1, 2018. Our finance team pretty much has ours all put together. Still some tweaking that needs to be done, but we're almost there. where are other states as far as percentage on Medicaid? Is Colorado's 25% high or low? Actually, Colorado, now if I'm reading the question right, I think this may be getting into coverage in Colorado. Our Medicaid plan is pretty modest. It is not an extravagant Medicaid plan. So it basically is about what is, it's more than 25% for sure. It's quite a bit more of coverage provisions for Medicaid. There are a lot of legislators who will tell you we have a pretty generous Medicaid plan, but it's not as generous as a lot of other states. I think probably some of the larger states, California, New York, Massachusetts, Florida, a lot of these states have much more robust Medicaid plans, certainly far more so than Colorado. So that keeps our per capita dollar figure pretty much around $1,400 per person in the state of Colorado, and in many of those states I just mentioned, it is well over 10 and 12,000 per individual. Now keep in mind too that Medicaid, about half of Medicaid goes to health care. The other half goes to long-term care, nursing homes, disabled individuals, et cetera. So keep in mind that when I talk about that $800 billion for Medicaid in Colorado, roughly half of that is for health care and half of that is for long-term care. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Again, my many thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day. It is beautiful.